History isn't always made by the giants. Sometimes it's made by the ghosts. The people who slipped through the cracks of a busy city, carrying a heavy secret in a light jacket. On March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was at the peak of his Great Communicator powers. He had just finished a routine speech to 3,500 members of the AFL-CIO. He was relaxed. He was the Jipper. But as he stepped out of the VIP exit of the Washington Hilton, he was walking into a kill zone that had been prepared not by a political mastermind, but by a lonely, broken, and mentally challenged young man obsessed with a movie. To understand Reagan's point of view, we first have to understand the shadow that eclipsed him. John Hinckley Jr. didn't care about Reagan's economic policies. He didn't care about the Cold War. Hinckley was living in a different reality, one projected onto his cinema screen. For years, Hinckley had been obsessed with the film Taxi Driver. He saw himself as Travis Bickle, the alienated veteran played by Robert De Niro. And just like the character in the movie, Hinckley believed that the only way to gain the love of a woman, in this case, a young Jodie Foster, was through a historical act of violence. Just 2 hours before the shooting, Hinckley sat in room 312 of the Park Central Hotel. He wrote a letter to Foster. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a suicide note written in the ink of a delusion. Jodie, I would abandon this idea of getting Reagan in a second if I could only win your heart and live out the rest of my life with you. I am asking you to please look into your heart and at least give me the chance, with this historical deed, to gain your respect and love. He tucked a .22 caliber Rome RG-14 revolver into his pocket. He had loaded it with Devastator bullets, rounds designed to explode upon impact, turning a small entry wound into a catastrophic internal blast. From Reagan's perspective, this was the rope line, the part of the job he excelled at. He saw the flashes of cameras, heard the shouting of reporters. Mr. President, Mr. President. He turned to his left, raising a hand in that characteristic breezy wave. He was exactly 15 feet from the armored limousine. In the span of less than 2 seconds, the world shattered. 6 shots were fired. One of them hit Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy in the abdomen. McCarthy had intentionally made himself a human shield, spreading his arms wide to catch a bullet intended for Reagan. The final shot hit the armored side of the limousine, ricocheted off the metal, and finds the tiny gap in the door hinge through which it got to President Reagan. It didn't hit Reagan directly. It hit the car, flattened into a coin-shaped piece of lead, and sliced into Reagan's left underarm. It didn't feel like a bullet. To Reagan, it felt like a hammer blow to the ribs. Jerry Parr, the head of the Secret Service detail, didn't wait to see who was shooting. He saw the flash in his peripheral vision and reacted with the instinct of a predator. He grabbed Reagan by the waist and shoulders and literally hurled him into the back of the car. Parr landed on top of him. The door slammed. The tires screeched as the limo sped toward the White House. Parr looked at the president. He saw Reagan's lips beginning to turn blue. Then he saw it, bright, frothy, pink blood bubbling at the corner of Reagan's mouth. This wasn't a broken rib. This was a punctured lung. Parr grabbed the radio. Stagecoach to hospital. We're going to George Washington. We're not going home. While surgeons at George Washington University Hospital were cutting into the President of the United States. 5 miles away, the nerve center of the free world was suffering a massive stroke. The Situation Room was a tomb of tension. The Vice President, George H.W. Bush, was on a plane somewhere over Texas. The Speaker of the House was unreachable. The line of succession was a blur. And in the vacuum of power, the egos of Washington's elite began to clash with the cold reality of the Cold War. You have to remember the context of 1981. This wasn't just a crime, it was a potential act of war. The first question on every cabinet member's mind wasn't, how is the president? It was, are the Russians behind this? The Pentagon went to DEFCON 2. Nuclear silos were put on alert. Intelligence officers were frantically scanning Soviet radio frequencies for any sign of a coordinated strike. If Reagan died and the chain of command was broken, the United States was at its most vulnerable since Pearl Harbor. At this point, this man called Alexander Haig entered the picture. Haig was the Secretary of State, a former 4-star general with a temperament made of flint and gunpowder. He arrived at the White House frantic, his face pale, his shirt damp with sweat. He looked like a man who believed the world was ending, and he decided he was the only one who could stop it. In the Situation Room, Haig began barking orders. He clashed immediately with Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. Weinberger wanted to raise the military alert status. Haig thought that would provoke the Soviets. But the real explosion happened when the press started asking questions. The American public was terrified. They needed to know who was running the country. Haig, driven by a mix of adrenaline and a misplaced sense of duty, bolted out of the Situation Room and ran toward the White House briefing room. He didn't take the elevator. He ran up the stairs, breathless. Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State in that order. As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending the return of the Vice President. He said. The room went silent. In that one sentence, Haig had committed a dual sin. First, he was factually wrong. The Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate both precede the Secretary of State in the line of succession. Second, he sounded like a man staging a coup. In the hospital, Reagan was under anesthesia. In the air, Bush was silent. In the White House, the cabinet was horrified. Haig's "I am in control" speech didn't calm the nation. It made people wonder if the government was falling apart. Meanwhile, Air Force Two was screaming across the sky. George H.W. Bush was in a nightmare scenario. He was being told his friend was shot, possibly dead, and he was the spare tire about to be inflated. His aides urged him to take a helicopter directly to the White House lawn when he landed a show of force to prove he was in charge. But Bush, ever the diplomat, refused. Back in the Situation Room, the bickering continued. Weinberger and Haig were nearly at blows over the football, the briefcase containing the nuclear launch codes. Who held it? Who had the authority to open it? For 4 hours, the United States was a ship without a captain. The Constitution provides the 25th Amendment for these moments. But the cabinet was too scared to invoke it. They didn't want to admit to the world or to the Soviets that the president was incapacitated. They sat in the smoke-filled room, watching the clock, waiting for a phone call from a hospital recovery room that would tell them if they still had a leader, or if they were about to start a new, uncertain era. Meanwhile, in the operating room, Mr. Reagan, the actor, and the president merged into a single, historical persona, while the Situation Room was in a state of panic. Ronald Reagan was performing the most important role of his life, the unflappable leader. By the time the presidential limousine screeched to a halt at George Washington University Hospital, Ronald Reagan was gray. His blood pressure was plummeting, 70 over nothing. He was essentially a dead man walking. He collapsed just inside the doors, his knees buckling as the Secret Service hauled him toward a trauma bay. But as the medical team began to strip away his custom-tailored suit, something remarkable happened. The Great Communicator woke up. In politics, optics are everything. Reagan knew that if the world saw a weak, dying old man, the presidency would crumble. Even as he gasped for air, his mind went back to the Hollywood backlots. He knew he had to stay in character. As the nurses worked frantically to insert 4 lines of monitors, Reagan looked up at one of them and whispered, "Does Nancy know about this? I hope she'll forgive me for not ducking." He said. It was a line borrowed from Jack Dempsey, the legendary boxer who said the same thing to his wife after losing the heavyweight title in 1926. Even in a state of shock, Reagan was scouring his memory for the perfect script. The most famous exchange occurred just as they were preparing to put him under anesthesia for the surgery to remove the bullet. The room was packed with elite surgeons, none of whom wanted to be the person who lost a president on the table. The tension was suffocating. Reagan looked at the lead surgeon, Dr. Joseph Giordano, a staunch liberal Democrat, and managed a weak smile. "Please tell me you're all Republicans," he said. Without missing a beat, Giordano replied, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans." The room erupted in a brief, nervous laughter. The tension broke. The doctor's hands stopped shaking. By cracking a joke, Reagan had done something 1,000 security details couldn't. He had regained control of the room. To the public, these were just quips from a brave man, but historians see them as a calculated strategic masterstroke. Reagan was 70 years old at the time, the oldest man to ever hold the office. His critics had spent the entire campaign saying he was too old, too fragile, and mentally checked out. If Reagan had arrived at the hospital crying or silent, the narrative would have been the president is incapacitated. Instead, within hours, the wires were buzzing with his jokes. The message to the American people, and more importantly, to the Soviet Union was clear. You can shoot him. You can collapse his lung. You can bleed him dry. But you cannot break his spirit. Even when he couldn't speak, he kept the act going. After the surgery, while he was still intubated and unable to talk, Reagan asked for a pen and a notepad. His advisors expected a dying wish or a secret command for the Situation Room. Instead, Reagan wrote, "I'd like to do this whole thing over again, but without the shooting part." Later, when a nurse asked him how he felt, he scribbled, "All in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," which was a classic vaudeville joke about a dull city. This wasn't just being a funny guy. This was psychological warfare. By refusing to be a victim, Reagan turned a national tragedy into a personal triumph. His approval ratings didn't just go up. They skyrocketed to 73%. He had achieved a level of untouchability that would define the rest of his 8 years in office. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a legend in the making. Now, this is where the story shifts from a political thriller to a psychological dark dive. While Reagan was cracking jokes in a hospital, the FBI was uncovering a rabbit hole of obsession that would eventually put the entire American legal system on trial. While the president was recovering behind the white walls of George Washington University Hospital, federal agents were kicking down the door of room 312 at the Park Central Hotel. What they expected to find was a political cell map of Washington, a list of co-conspirators, or perhaps a Soviet handler. What they found was far more disturbing. They found a mind of John Hinckley Jr. spilled across the furniture. There were no maps. There were no political manifestos. Instead, there were stacks of letters addressed to a teenage girl he had never met, the actress Jodie Foster. The investigators quickly realized that Reagan wasn't the target because of who he was, but because of what he represented. To Hinckley, the President of the United States was simply a prop in a grand, twisted romantic gesture. The FBI recovered a letter Hinckley had written just 2 hours before the shooting. It wasn't a cry of death to tyrants. It was a love letter written in the ink of a madman. The deep knowledge secret that shocked the investigators. Hinckley had been stalking the presidency for months. He had followed Jimmy Carter during the 1980 campaign. He had stood in the crowds at Nashville, a gun in his pocket, waiting for a clear shot at Carter. He had even been arrested at an airport in Nashville with 3 handguns and handcuffs in his luggage, and he was simply fined and released. If the system had worked in October 1980, Ronald Reagan would never have been shot in March 1981. The trial began in 1982, and it quickly became one of the most controversial in American history. The evidence was undeniable. We had video of him shooting the president. We had the gun. We had the confession. But Hinckley's defense team, led by Vincent Fuller, didn't argue that he didn't do it. They argued that he couldn't help it. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Hinckley was suffering from process schizophrenia. They argued that his obsession with the movie Taxi Driver was so complete that he believed he was living inside the film. He wasn't shooting a president. He was playing a role. On June 21st, 1982, the jury delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the White House and the streets of America. Not guilty by reason of insanity. The public was outraged. How could a man shoot the president on live television, nearly killing 4 people and permanently paralyzing press secretary James Brady, and walk away without a prison sentence? The Hinckley verdict didn't just end the trial. It changed the law of the land. Before 1982, the burden of proof in an insanity defense was on the prosecution to prove the defendant was sane. Because of the Hinckley case, Congress passed the Insanity Defense Reform Act of 1984, shifted the burden. Now, the defense had to prove the defendant was insane by clear and convincing evidence. The guilty but mentally ill verdict. Several states created this new category so that people like Hinckley would still serve a prison sentence even if they received psychiatric care. Strict supervision. Hinckley wasn't free, but he was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where he would remain for the next 35 years. For Reagan, the verdict was a bitter pill. He had almost died, and his friend Jim Brady was now confined to a wheelchair for life. But in typical Reagan fashion, he kept his public response measured, privately. However, the investigation revealed something the public didn't know for years. John Hinckley's family and the family of Vice President George H.W. Bush were actually acquaintances. John's brother, Scott Hinckley, was scheduled to have dinner with Neil Bush, the vice president's son, the very next day. It was a coincidence so bizarre that conspiracy theorists have feasted on it for decades. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. A single, lonely man with a cheap revolver had found a crack in the most sophisticated security system in the world, all to impress a girl who didn't know he existed. They say that time heals all wounds. But in the case of March 30th, 1981, time only deepened the impact. Ronald Reagan walked out of the hospital 12 days after being shot, buttoning his suit jacket over his bandages to hide the pain. He insisted on walking into the White House on his own 2 feet. To the world, He was the invincible president, but inside the Oval Office, behind the closed doors of the residence, the man who went into that hospital was not the same man who came out. Reagan had always been a man of faith, but after the shooting, his spirituality took on a steel-edged intensity. He told his daughter, Patty, and later his diary, that he believed God had spared his life for a singular purpose, to end the Cold War. Whatever happens now, I owe my life to God. I will try to serve him in every way I can. He said, this wasn't just personal piety. This belief drove his foreign policy. It gave him the absolute, unshakable confidence to sit across from Mikhail Gorbachev and demand the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. He felt he was on borrowed time, and he wasn't going to waste a second of it. The Great Communicator became the Great Negotiator because he felt he was working on a deadline set by Providence. But while Reagan found a new lease on life, others were left in the shadows of that 1.7 seconds. James Brady, the witty, brilliant press secretary, had been hit in the head by Hinckley's first shot. He survived, but he was never the same. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, struggling with his speech and his memory. His wife, Sarah Brady, turned that tragedy into a crusade. For 10 years, she fought for what would become the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. In 1993, the man who had been shot alongside Reagan watched as the bill was finally signed into law, requiring background checks and a waiting period for handgun purchases. When James Brady died in 2014, his death was ruled a homicide. 33 years later, John Hinckley's bullet had finally finished the job. The Secret Service changed forever that day. Before Reagan, the president was a public figure who shook hands and walked through crowds with a sense of accessibility. After Hinckley, the bubble became permanent. Metal detectors, bulletproof glass, and massive security cordons became the new normal. The gap, that 15-foot space between a building and a car, was never left unprotected again. Jerry Parr, the man who saved the president's life, retired with the knowledge that he had done the impossible. But he carried the weight of the day until his death in 2015, often visiting the hospital where he had made the split-second decision that changed history. And what a ghost. In 2016, 35 years after he stepped out of the shadows at the Washington Hilton, John Hinckley Jr. was granted full release from St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He was no longer the pale, obsessed young man with a .22 revolver. He was an elderly man with a guitar, living with his mother in Virginia. The man who nearly toppled a superpower and shattered a presidency was now just a footnote in a history book, a reminder of how fragile the world really is. Ronald Reagan lived for 23 years after the shooting. He survived the Cold War, survived cancer, and ultimately survived the attempt on his life. But if you look closely at the photos from his second term, you can see a slight stiffness in his gait, a physical echo of the lead fragment that sat just an inch from his heart. He once said, "Life is a series of close calls." On March 30th, 1981, the call was as close as it gets. It was a day of chaos, a day of tragedy, and a day of jokes told in the face of death. It was the day that 1.7 seconds changed the world. This is Static Solved Mysteries. Like and subscribe to listen to more true crime stories like this, and make sure to listen to the next video for John Hinckley's point of view. Have a nice day.